Sometimes the richest man in the room is also the loneliest. Whit Garner learned this truth sitting on a dusty Colorado train station bench in 1892, his silver hair catching the last light of day while he waited for a train that would take him back to an empty mansion. At 58, he owned more cattle and land than any man in 3 counties, but success had cost him everything that truly mattered. Beside him sat 8-year-old Jesse Pike, clutching a tin pail of cornbread for his widowed mother, who ran a small boarding house nearby. When Jesse noticed the sadness in Whit's eyes, he did something simple yet profound. He invited the wealthy stranger to dinner. That one act of kindness would change 3 lives forever. What started as a humble meal around a kitchen table became something far greater than either could imagine. But what would this dinner cost Whit when the truth about his past finally came to light? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun painted the Colorado sky in shades of amber and rose as Whit Garner shifted his weight on the hard wooden bench, the northbound train ticket heavy in his vest pocket like a stone against his heart. Around him, the station buzzed with the familiar sounds of evening travelers, the scrape of boot heels on weathered planks, the distant whistle of an approaching freight train, the murmur of conversations he couldn't quite make out, but none of it touched him. For 3 decades, he had built an empire that stretched from the foothills of the Rockies to the plains beyond Denver, acre by acre, deal by deal, until his name carried weight in every bank and courthouse from Colorado Springs to Cheyenne. Yet sitting here now, watching families reunite and lovers embrace, he felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The boy beside him couldn't sit still. Jesse Pike's legs swung back and forth from the bench, his worn boots barely grazing the ground, while his small hands gripped the handle of a dented tin pail with the fierce protection of someone who understood hunger. Freckles dotted his sun-browned cheeks like scattered pennies, and his sandy hair stuck up in cowlicks that spoke of a morning spent helping with chores rather than primping in front of a mirror. Everything about him radiated the kind of earnest energy that comes from children who have learned responsibility too young, yet somehow managed to keep their wonder intact. "Mister, you sure look sad," Jesse said, his voice carrying the frank honesty that only children possess. "You waiting for someone special?" Whit glanced down at the boy, surprised by the directness of the question. In his world, men spoke in careful circles, never quite saying what they meant, always calculating advantage. "Just waiting for a train, son." "Where you headed?" "North. Business." The words came out clipped, automatic, the same response he'd given 100 times to 100 different people. But Jesse's clear blue eyes held no judgment, only genuine curiosity, and something in Whit's chest loosened slightly. "Business must be mighty important to make a man look so lonesome," Jesse observed with the wisdom of someone who had watched his mother's face too many evenings as she counted coins by lamplight. Before Whit could form a response, Jesse hopped down from the bench and extended his small hand. "I'm Jesse Pike. My mama says it's rude not to introduce yourself when you're sharing a bench with someone." Despite himself, Whit found his lips twitching upward, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. He clasped the boy's hand, marveling at the calluses already forming on such young palms. "Whit Garner, pleased to meet you, Jesse Pike. You got a family, Mr. Garner?" The question hit like a physical blow. Whit's hand instinctively moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt lay a small silver locket, the only thing he carried of a life that had ended in screaming horses and splintered wood 5 years ago. "I did, once." Jesse's expression softened with understanding that seemed far too mature for his 8 years. "Me too. My papa died when I was 6. But I got my mama still, and she's the finest woman in all of Colorado Territory. She runs a boarding house, and she makes the best cornbread this side of the Mississippi." He held up his tin pail proudly. "This here's for our supper tonight. She's lucky to have such a thoughtful son." "She works real hard," Jesse continued, settling back onto the bench beside Whit. "Sometimes I see her crying when she thinks I'm asleep, but she always has a smile for me come morning. She says a smile is the best gift you can give someone, 'cause it don't cost nothing but it's worth everything. Whit studied the boy's profile, noting the way his jaw set with determination, even as his voice carried traces of worry. Here was a child who had learned to be strong for his mother, to notice her tears and carry her burdens in the way only the children of struggling families could. It stirred something in Whit's chest, a memory of his own childhood, before wealth had built walls around his heart. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman." "She is. She can fix anything: torn shirts, broken chairs, even broken hearts. She fixed mine when Papa died." Jesse's voice grew quiet, thoughtful. "She told me that love don't die when people do. It just changes shape, like water turning to mist. You can't see it the same way, but it's still there, still real." The words hung in the evening air between them, and Whit felt something crack open inside his chest. For 5 years, he had carried his grief like armor, using it to justify his isolation, his refusal to risk loving anyone again. But here was this boy, who had lost just as much, speaking of love as transformation rather than ending. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Whit said softly. Jesse beamed at the praise, then grew serious again. "Mr. Garner, you got anywhere special to be tonight? I mean, I know you got that train to catch, but—" "The train's not for another hour," Whit found himself saying, though he wasn't sure why. Something about the boy's presence made him reluctant to retreat into his usual solitude. "Well then," Jesse said, standing up and brushing dust from his patched trousers, "do you want to have dinner with my mom?" The invitation hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. Whit had eaten in the finest restaurants from San Francisco to New York, had been served by chefs who could transform simple ingredients into works of art. But he couldn't remember the last time someone had invited him to share a meal out of simple kindness, without ulterior motive or expectation of favor. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It ain't imposing if you're invited," Jesse interrupted with 8-year-old logic. "Besides, Mama always makes too much, and she says food tastes better when there's more folks around the table to share it with." Whit looked at his pocket watch, then at the boy's hopeful face, then at the train ticket in his hand. The northbound express would take him back to his ranch, to his empty house with its echoing halls and silent rooms, back to ledgers and cattle counts and the endless accumulation of wealth that had somehow become the only thing that gave his days meaning. "I suppose I could spare a few minutes," he heard himself say. Jesse's whoop of joy could have been heard 3 counties over. "Come on then, Mr. Garner, Mama's going to be so pleased to meet you." As they walked through the dusty streets of the small Colorado town, Whit found himself seeing the place through different eyes. Where he had initially noticed only the weathered storefronts and modest homes, he now saw flower boxes lovingly tended, children playing in yards while their mothers called them in for supper, men removing their hats to nod respectfully as they passed. There was a sense of community here that his wealth had never been able to buy, a feeling of belonging that made his chest ache with longing. Jesse chatted as they walked, pointing out landmarks with the pride of someone showing off a beloved home. "That's Mrs. Henderson Storch gives me penny candy sometimes when I help her move heavy boxes. And that's the church where Papa and Mama got married. And there's Doc Morrison's house. He delivered me right there in that front room." Every step took them further from the world, Whit knew, deeper into a life where people measured worth not in acres or cattle, but in kindness given and received. By the time they reached the small clapboard boarding house with its hand-painted sign reading "Pike's Place Clean Rooms, Good Meals, Fair Prices," Whit felt as though he had crossed more than just a few town blocks. The house itself was modest but well-maintained, with a wide front porch that held 2 rocking chairs and a collection of potted plants that spoke of loving care. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of something savory that made Whit's stomach growl in response. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of lamplight, and suddenly he understood why Jesse had been so eager to share this place with a stranger. "Mama!" Jesse called as he bounded up the porch steps. "I brought someone for supper." The door opened, and Whit Garner's carefully constructed world shifted on its axis. Helen Pike stood framed in the doorway, her dark hair caught back in a simple bun, her green eyes bright with curiosity and warmth. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and pressed, and her hands work-worn but gentle-moved to smooth her apron as she took in the sight of her son, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger. "Jessie," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who had never lost her capacity for laughter, despite life's hardships. "You can't just bring people home without warning." "But Mama, he looked so lonesome at the station, and you always say—" "That kindness costs nothing but means everything," Helen finished with a gentle smile. Her eyes met Whit's, and he saw in them the same quality her son possessed, the ability to see straight through to the heart of things without judgment. "I'm Helen Pike. I apologize for my son's enthusiasm, but you're welcome to join us if you'd like." "Whit Garner, ma'am," he said, removing his hat. "I don't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Helen said, stepping back to let them enter. "Jessie's right about my making too much, and anyone who can put such a smile on my boy's face is welcome at my table." As Whit stepped across the threshold, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of coming home. The house was small but spotlessly clean, furnished with pieces that had been chosen for comfort rather than display. A sampler hung on the wall reading, "Home is where love lives," and everywhere he looked, he saw signs of a life lived with intention and care. On the kitchen table sat Helen's wedding ring, simple gold that caught the lamplight as she moved to check something in the oven. She still wore it, Whit noticed, this woman who had loved and lost and somehow found the strength to keep her heart open to possibility. As she bustled about preparing their meal, humming softly under her breath while Jessie regaled her with tales of his day, Whit understood that he had stumbled into something presusa, family-bound, not by blood alone, but by the choice to love each other fiercely in the face of life's uncertainties. For the first time in 5 years, Whit Garner felt truly wealthy. The meal that followed was unlike anything Whit had experienced in years. Helen's cornbread was warm and golden, paired with a hearty stew that filled the small kitchen with the aroma of home and comfort. But it wasn't the food that captured his attention, it was the easy conversation, the gentle teasing between mother and son, the way they included him naturally in their evening ritual, as if he belonged there. "Mr. Garner," Helen said as she ladled stew into his bowl, "Jessie tells me you're a businessman. What sort of business brings you to our little town?" Whit hesitated, unused to explaining his empire in simple terms. "Cattle, mostly. Some land holdings." He took a spoonful of stew, savoring the rich flavors that spoke of careful preparation and love. "This is delicious, Mrs. Pike. Please, call me Helen, and thank you, it's my grandmother's recipe. She always said the secret ingredient was making it for people you care about." Jessie bounced in his chair, his excitement barely contained. "Tell him about the piano, Mama." A soft blush colored Helen's cheeks. "Jessie, I'm sure Mr. Garner doesn't want to hear about such things." "Actually, I'd like to hear about it," Whit said, genuinely curious. There was something in the way Jessie's eyes lit up that suggested this piano held special meaning. Helen's fingers unconsciously traced the worn wood of the table. "There's a piano for sale at Mrs. Henderson's store. It belonged to her aunt who passed last spring. It's not much to look at, needs tuning, and the bench is wobbly, but it has the most beautiful tone." "Mama used to play," Jessie chimed in, his voice filled with pride. "Before Papa died, she'd play every evening after supper. She taught me a few songs, but we ain't had a piano since we had to sell ours to pay for Papa's medicine." The silence that followed carried the weight of loss and sacrifice. Whit found himself studying Helen's hands, graceful despite their calluses, fingers that had once danced across ivory keys but now scrubbed floors and mended clothes to keep her small family afloat. "You could play again," Whit said gently. Helen's smile was wistful. "Maybe someday, when things are more settled." It was then that Jessie pulled something from his Poquita small harmonica, its silver surface tarnished and one of its reeds clearly broken. Despite its condition, he handled it with the reverence reserved for precious treasures. "Papa gave this to me before he died," Jessie said, running his fingers over the damaged instrument. He said music was the best gift a man could give his family, 'cause it lives in your heart even when everything else is gone. I've been saving my pennies to get it fixed. But he shrugged with the resignation of someone who had learned that wants often went unfulfilled. But fixing harmonicas costs money we need for other things. Helen finished softly, her hand briefly touching her son's shoulder. How much would it cost to repair? Whit asked. Oh, we couldn't ask you to. I'm not offering, Whit said quickly, seeing the pride flash in Helen's eyes. I'm just curious about such things. Jessie looked up hopefully. Old Pete at the music shop says it'd be 50 cents to replace the broken reed and clean it proper, but 50 cents might as well be $50 when you're… Jessie, Helen warned gently. When you're behind on the mortgage, Jessie finished in a whisper, his eyes downcast. The words fell into the warm kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward until they filled every corner of the room. Helen's face flushed with embarrassment, and Whit could see her struggling between the need to maintain dignity and the reality of their situation. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You shouldn't have to hear about our troubles. Jessie, you know we don't discuss family business with… How far behind? Whit asked quietly. Helen's hands stilled on her napkin. Mr. Garner, I appreciate your concern, but… 3 months, Jessie said, his young voice heavy with worry he shouldn't have had to carry. Mr. Thornfield came by last week and said we got till the end of the month to pay up or he's going to take the house. Jessie, it's true, Mama, and you've been crying every night thinking I don't hear, but I do. I hear you counting coins and writing figures and whispering prayers when you think I'm asleep. Tears gathered in Helen's eyes, and she turned away, her shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. Whit felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of anger at the situation and admiration for this woman who carried such burdens with such grace. Mrs. Pike, Helen, he said carefully, what's the total amount owed? I can't ask you to… You're not asking, I'm asking you. Helen met his eyes, and in them he saw the war between pride and desperation that he recognized from his own past, before wealth had made such choices academic. $240, she whispered. I had to use the mortgage money for Jesse's medicine when he had pneumonia last winter, and then the roof leaked and needed fixing, and the well pump broke. $240. Whit had spent more than that on a single dinner in Denver. He had paid 3 times that amount for a saddle he barely used. The sum that threatened to destroy this family's world was less than what he carried in his wallet for incidental expenses. And Thornfield won't extend the terms? Helen's laugh was bitter. Marcus Thornfield doesn't believe in extending anything to anyone. He says business is business and sentiment is for fools. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He's probably right. We signed the papers. We agreed to the terms. Just because life got difficult doesn't mean we deserve special consideration. That's not true, Mama, Jessie said fiercely. You work harder than anybody in this whole town. You deserve good things. Hard work doesn't always equal reward, sweetheart. Sometimes life just is what it is. Whit watched this exchange, seeing in it the heartbreak of good people ground down by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus Thornfield, he knew the name, though he'd never met the man. Another small-town banker squeezing families for every penny, building his modest empire on the backs of people who could least afford to lose. There has to be something that can be done, Whit said. Like what? Helen asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had explored every option. I've asked for work wherever I can find it. I take in washing, I mend clothes, I clean houses. Jessie helps by doing odd jobs for neighbors, but it's not enough, and time's running out. Jessie's small hand slipped into Whit's. Mr. Garner, you seem like a smart man. Is there anything you can think of that might help my mama? The question hung in the air, loaded with hope and innocence. Whit looked at the boy's trusting face, then at Helen's proud but desperate expression, and felt the weight of their situation settle on his shoulders. He could write them a check right now, solve their problems with a stroke of his pen, the way he'd solved dozens of other problems throughout his life. But even as the thought occurred to him, He saw the wariness in Helen's eyes, the way she'd already begun to withdraw at the first hint of charity. This was a woman who would rather lose everything than accept handouts, who valued her independence as much as her son's welfare. "I might know someone," he heard himself say. "Let me think on it." Jesse's face lit up with hope, but Helen's expression remained guarded. "Mr. Garner, we're grateful for your kindness, but we can't accept." "You're not accepting anything yet," Whit said gently. "I'm just saying I might know someone who could help. No promises, no obligations." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, its soft voice reminding Whit that his train would be departing soon. But as he looked around the warm kitchen, at Jesse's hopeful face and Helen's carefully controlled desperation, he realized something had changed. The thought of returning to his empty mansion, to his solitary life of ledgers and cattle counts, held no appeal. "I should be getting back to the station," he said, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. "Of course," Helen said, rising to walk him to the door. "Thank you for joining us. It's been nice to have company." As they stood on the porch, Whit turned back to look at the modest house with its warm windows and the family that had somehow claimed a piece of his heart in the span of a single evening. Jesse pressed his broken harmonica into Whit's hand. "For luck," the boy said seriously. "It don't play proper, but Papa always said broken things can still be beautiful if you look at them right." Whit closed his fingers around the damaged instrument, feeling its weight so small, yet somehow heavier than all the gold in his coffers. In that moment, standing on Helen Pike's porch with her son's gift in his hand and the sound of approaching train wheels in the distance, Whit Garner made a decision that would change everything. He would not be getting on that northbound train tonight. The next morning found Whit standing on Helen's front porch with his leather satchel in one hand and his hat in the other, feeling more uncertain than he had since his first cattle purchase 30 years ago. Through the window, he could see Helen moving about the kitchen, preparing breakfast for her boarders, her movements efficient despite the early hour. The sight of her hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in caring for others made something in his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Jesse was the first to spot him, his face lighting up like sunrise as he burst through the front door. "Mr. Garner, you came back. I told Mama you would, but she said—" "Jesse Pike, mind your manners," Helen's voice carried from the doorway, though Whit could hear the surprise in her tone. She appeared behind her son, wiping her hands on her apron, her green eyes questioning. "Mr. Garner, I thought you had a train to catch." "I did," Whit said simply. "I chose not to catch it." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Helen's eyes searched his face, looking for motives, for the catch that experience had taught her always existed when things seemed too good to be true. "I was wondering," Whit continued, setting his satchel down carefully, "if you might have a room available for a few days. I find myself with some unexpected business in town." Helen's hands twisted in her apron. "Mr. Garner, if this is about what Jesse told you last night—" "It's about needing a place to stay," Whit interrupted gently. "Nothing more, nothing less. I'll pay the standard rate, same as any other boarder." "We got the best room in the house," Jesse declared, bouncing on his toes. "It's got a view of the mountains and everything." Helen's internal struggle was visible on her face, the need for paying customers warring, with her wariness of charity disguised as business. Finally, practicality won. "It's $1 a night, meals included, payment in advance." Whit nodded and reached for his wallet, careful to extract only the modest bills rather than the larger denominations that might raise questions. As he handed over the money, their fingers brushed briefly, and he felt something electric pass between thema recognition that went deeper than mere attraction. "I'll show you to your room," Helen said, her voice slightly breathless. "Jesse, go finish your breakfast." The room she led him to was small but immaculate, with a window that indeed offered a stunning view of the mountains painted gold by the morning sun. A simple quilt covered the narrow bed, and a washstand held a pitcher and basin that gleamed from careful polishing. On the windowsill sat a small pot containing a struggling geranium that someone, Helen, he suspected, had been coaxing back to health. "It's perfect," Whit said, and meant it. He had slept in hotel suites that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, but this simple room felt more welcoming than any of them. "Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6, Helen said, her voice carefully businesslike. "I ask that boarders keep their rooms tidy and—" Helen, the sound of her name, stopped her mid-sentence. "I want you to know that my staying here has nothing to do with pity or charity. You run a fine establishment, and I'm grateful for the accommodation." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth written there. "You're not like most of the men who pass through here," she said finally. "How so?" "Most men look at me and see either a burden or an opportunity. You look at me and see a person." The simple statement hit Whit with unexpected force. In his world of business dealings and social obligations, people were often reduced to their utility, what they could provide, what they were worth, what advantage they offered. But Helen was right. When he looked at her, he saw something infinitely more complex and precious. "You are a person," he said quietly, "a remarkable one." Color rose in her cheeks, and she turned toward the door. "I should let you settle in. Jesse will want to show you around town if you're inclined. He's quite proud of this place." After she left, Whit stood at the window, fingering Jesse's broken harmonica and watching the town come to life below. From his room, he could see the main street with its collection of modest businesses. Henderson's general store, the blacksmith shop with its forge already glowing, the small church with its white steeple reaching toward the endless Colorado sky. In his vest pocket, his cattle brand iron seemed to weigh heavier than usual, a reminder of the empire he had built, the identity he had wrapped around himself like armor. But here, in this simple room, with its struggling geranium and honest quilt, that identity felt less important than it had in years. Here, he was simply Whit Garner, a man who had found something worth staying for. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Jesse's voice came through the wood, barely contained excitement, making his words tumble together. "Mr. Garner, can I come in? I got something to show you." "Come in, son." Jesse burst through the door, carrying a wooden crate filled with tool shammers, screwdrivers, a small saw, all well used but carefully maintained. "Mama said you might want to see the town, but I thought maybe first you could help me fix the loose step on the back porch. I've been trying to do it myself, but I ain't quite strong enough to hold the board steady and drive the nails at the same time." The request was so simple, so genuine, that Whit felt something ease in his chest. When was the last time someone had asked for his help with something that mattered not because of his money or influence, but because of his hands and his presence? "I'd be honored to help," he said, rolling up his sleeves. Working alongside Jesse on the porch repair, Whit discovered muscles he'd forgotten he had and skills he hadn't used since his own boyhood. The boy chattered as they worked, sharing stories about the town and its people with the generous spirit of someone who saw good in everyone he met. "That's Mr. Jameson coming out of the bank," Jesse said, pointing with his hammer toward a well-dressed man with silver hair and a purposeful stride. "He owns the hardware store and the lumber mill. Mama says he's sweet on Mrs. Henderson, but they're both too proud to say anything about it." Whit glanced up from the nail he was positioning, taking in the sight of two middle-aged people, carefully not looking at each other as they went about their morning business. It was a dance. He recognized the careful circling of hearts that had been hurt before, the hesitation that came with understanding how much there was to lose. "Sometimes pride can cost more than it's worth," he said quietly. "Is that why you never got married again?" Jesse asked with the devastating directness of childhood. The hammer nearly slipped from Whit's fingers. "What makes you think I was married before?" "You got that look in your eyes sometimes, like you're seeing someone who ain't there anymore. Mama gets the same look when she thinks about Papa." From the mouths of babes, Whit set down his hammer and sat back on his heels, studying this remarkable child who saw so much more than most adults noticed. "You're very observant, Jesse. Mama says paying attention is how you learn to care about people proper. She says most folks are carrying something heavy, and if you look close enough, You can see it in their eyes. Your mother is a wise woman. The wisest, Jesse agreed solemnly. Then his expression brightened. But she laughs more since you've been here. I ain't heard her humming in the kitchen for months, but she was humming this morning when she made the biscuits. The observation sent warmth spreading through Whit's chest, followed immediately by a flutter of something that might have been hope or fear. He was walking into dangerous territory, letting himself care about these people, letting them matter to him. But as he looked at Jesse's earnest face and heard Helen's voice drifting through the kitchen window, he realized it was already too late to protect himself. He was already lost. 3 days into his stay at Pike's Place, Whit found himself settling into rhythms he hadn't experienced since childhood. Each morning, he woke to the sound of Helen moving quietly through the house, preparing breakfast for her small collection of Bordersa traveling salesmen, an elderly widower who'd taken permanent residence, and now him. The domesticity of it, the gentle routine of shared meals and evening conversations, filled spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. It was during one of these quiet mornings, as he sat at the kitchen table watching Helen work, that she finally spoke about her late husband. Thomas was a dreamer, she said, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. He believed in grand gestures and impossible schemes. When we married, he was convinced he could strike it rich in the silver mines. When that didn't work out, it was cattle ranching. Then it was going to be the railroad. Her hands stilled for a moment, and Whit saw her expression soften with memory. On the counter beside her lay her recipe book, a leather-bound collection of handwritten pages that had clearly been passed down through generations. The margins were filled with notes in different hands. Add more sage, mother. Thomas likes extra pepper, Jesse's favorite for his birthday. He sounds like a man who believed in possibilities, Whit said carefully. Helen's smile was both fond and sad. He was, right up until the end. Even when the doctor told us about his heart, Thomas was making plans for what we'd do when he got better. She resumed kneading, her movements more forceful now. I used to find it frustrating, the way he'd chase after dreams, instead of focusing on what was practical. Now I miss it terribly. What do you miss about it? The hope, she said simply. Thomas never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Even when we had to sell the piano to pay for his medicines, he'd promise me we'd get a better one someday. Even when the bills piled up and the work got harder, he'd hold me in the evening and talk about the house we'd build, the trips we'd take, the life we'd give Jesse. Whit watched her hands as she shaped the dough, noting the care she took, even with this simple task. Everything Helen did, she did with intention and love, from the way she arranged flowers in mason jars to brighten the dining room to the careful mending of Jesse's clothes that made patches look like decorations. He taught Jesse to play harmonica, she continued, nodding toward the recipe book, where a pressed flower marked one of the pages. Said music was the one thing that couldn't be sold or stolen or lost to bad luck. It lives in here, he'd tell Jesse, tapping his chest. No matter what happens in the world, what's in your heart stays with you. Jesse mentioned that, Whit said, thinking of the broken instrument still in his vest pocket. He's a remarkable boy. He is. Sometimes I think he's too remarkable for his own good. He worries about things no 8-year-old should have to worry about. Yesterday, I caught him trying to figure out how to sell his collection of marbles to help with the mortgage. The image of Jesse carefully counting his small treasures, trying to find a way to save his mother's home, made Whit's chest tighten. You've raised him well. I've tried. Some days I feel like I'm failing him terribly. A boy needs a father, needs someone to teach him how to be a man. I do my best, but you're teaching him the most important lessons, Whit interrupted gently. How to be kind, how to be responsible, how to care for others. Those aren't lessons that require a particular gender, Helen. They just require a loving heart. She looked up from her bread, flour dusting her cheek, and something passed between them and understanding that went beyond words. In that moment, Whit saw not just a struggling widow, but a woman of remarkable strength and grace who had managed to raise a son full of compassion despite facing hardships that would have broken lesser people. "Mr. Garner," she began, then caught herself. "Whit, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you really stay? And please don't tell me it's just about having business in town. I may be a simple woman, but I'm not a fool." The question hung in the air between them, honest and direct in the way Helen approached everything. Whit found himself studying her face, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her green eyes, the faint lines that spoke of laughter as much as worry. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I haven't felt at home anywhere in 5 years. But sitting at your table, listening to Jesse's stories, watching you move through your days with such purpose and grace, it feels like home." Helen's hands stilled completely, and color rose in her cheeks. "Whit, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not expecting anything. I'm just answering your question honestly." Before Helen could respond, Jesse burst through the kitchen door, his face bright with excitement and purpose. "Mama, Mr. Garner, you got to come see what Mr. Peterson's doing." "Jesse, what have I told you about running in the house?" "Sorry, Mama, but this is important. Mr. Peterson's got his wagon stuck in the mud down by Miller's Creek, and his horse is spooked, something fierce. He's got a whole load of furniture he's trying to deliver to the new family moving into the Hendrick place, and if he don't get it there today, they won't have anywhere to sleep tonight." Whit was already reaching for his hat. "How far is Miller's Creek?" "About a mile south of town," Helen said, concern creasing her brow. "But Whit, you don't need to—" "A man needs help, and I'm able to provide it," he said simply. "It's what neighbors do." The word hung in the air. Neighbors. Not border, not stranger, not temporary guest. Neighbors. People who belonged to each other in the way that mattered most. As they made their way toward Miller's Creek, Jesse chattering excitedly about the adventure and Helen walking beside him with careful steps that suggested she was still processing their earlier conversation, Whit realized something profound was happening. For 30 years, he had defined himself by what he owned, what he controlled, what he could buy or sell. But here, walking down a dusty road to help a man he'd never met simply because it was the right thing to do, he was discovering a different kind of wealth entirely. When they reached the creek, they found Peterson's wagon axle-deep in mud, the old man standing helplessly beside his frightened horse, while furniture wrapped in canvas tarps listed dangerously in the wagon bed. "Peterson," Whit called out, "looks like you could use some assistance." The relief on the old man's face was immediate and profound. "Mr. Garner, thank the Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do. This horse is too spooked to pull, and I can't get enough purchase in this mud to push." Whit rolled up his sleeves, his mind already working through the mechanics of the problem. "Jesse, I need you to go back to town and ask the blacksmith if we can borrow his block and tackle. Helen, can you help Mr. Peterson calm his horse?" As they worked together to free the wagon, Whit found himself thinking about Thomas Pike and his dreams of better tomorrows. Maybe the man had been onto something after all. Maybe believing in possibilities wasn't foolish. Maybe it was the only way to create the kind of life worth living. And maybe, just maybe, Whit was finally ready to start believing in possibilities again himself. The fourth evening of Whit's day brought an unexpected chill to the Colorado air, and Helen built up the fire in the parlor after supper. The other boarders had retired early, leaving the three of them gathered around the hearth, Jesse on the rug with his schoolwork, Helen mending a tear in one of her dresses, and Whit reading a week-old newspaper by lamplight. The domesticity of the scene struck him with its simple perfection, so different from the solitary evenings he'd spent in his mansion, surrounded by luxury, but starved for companionship. "Mr. Garner," Jesse said, looking up from his slate where he'd been practicing his letters, "can I ask you something personal?" Helen glanced up from her sewing, a warning look in her eyes. "Jesse?" "It's all right," Whit said, setting down his paper. He'd grown accustomed to the boy's directness, finding it refreshing after years of people who spoke in careful circles around him. "What's on your mind, son? Do you ever get lonesome in that big house of yours?" The question hit closer to home than Whit had expected. For a moment, he considered deflecting, giving one of the practiced responses he'd perfected over the years. Instead, he found himself reaching into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around something he'd carried for 5 years, but never shown to another soul. "Sometimes," he said quietly, withdrawing a small silver locket, "especially since my wife and daughter died." The silence that followed was profound. Helen's needle stopped mid-stitch, and Jesse's eyes grew wide with the solemn understanding that children sometimes possess about loss. The locket lay in Whit's palm, catching the firelight, its surface worn smooth by years of anxious handling. "What were their names?" Jesse asked softly. "Margaret and Emily. Maggie was my wife. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could fill a room. Emily was our daughter. She would have been 13 now." Whit's thumb traced the locket's edge. "They died in a carriage accident. The horses spooked during a thunderstorm, and the carriage overturned crossing a bridge." Helen set down her mending, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Whit." "I was supposed to be with them that day," he continued, the words coming easier than they had in years. "But I had a business meeting that ran late. Always another meeting, another deal, another opportunity that seemed too important to miss." He opened the locket, revealing a tiny daguerreotype of a beautiful woman holding a young girl with Whit's same thoughtful eyes. "I told myself I was building an empire for them, securing their future. But what I was really doing was trading time with the people I loved for money I didn't need." Jesse scooted closer, his small hand touching Whit's knee. "Is that why you look so sad sometimes, even when you're smiling?" "Yes, I suppose it is. Papa used to say that people we love don't really leave us," Jesse said with the earnest wisdom of childhood. "He said they just move to a different room in our hearts, and sometimes we can still hear them if we listen real quiet." Whit looked at this remarkable boy who had lost his father, but somehow maintained faith in love's endurance, and felt something crack open in his chestnut, the sharp pain he'd carried for 5 years, but something softer, like ice beginning to thaw. "Your papa was a wise man," Whit said. "He was, and he would have liked you, I can tell." Helen rose and moved to sit on the arm of Whit's chair, her hand settling gently on his shoulder. The touch was comforting rather than romantic, the gesture of someone who understood grief's weight. "Thank you for telling us," she said softly. "It helps me understand." She stopped abruptly, but Whit could guess what she'd been about to say. It helped her understand why he'd stayed, why he'd been drawn to their small family, why he looked at Jesse with such tender attention, and at her with eyes that held both longing and fear. "Helen," he said, looking up at her, "I need you to know something. When I look at you and Jesse, I'm not trying to replace what I lost. You're not substitutes or consolation prizes. You're—" he struggled for words that could encompass the truth. "You're something entirely new, something I never expected to find." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Helen's hand tightened on his shoulder, and he could see her own struggle reflected in her face, the pull between the safety of independence and the risk of opening her heart again. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too, and it terrifies me." Jesse looked between the two adults, his young face serious. "Are you going to get married?" "Jesse!" Helen exclaimed, her cheeks flaming. "Well, are you? 'Cause I think it would be nice to have a papa again, especially one who's good with tools and tells interesting stories and makes you smile the way you used to smile before Papa died." Out of the mouths of babes, Whit felt his heart constrict with a mixture of joy and terror. The boy's simple acceptance, his eagerness for a complete family again, made Whit want to promise things he wasn't sure he had the courage to deliver. "Marriage is something adults have to think about very carefully," Helen said, though her voice was gentle. "It's not just about wanting to be happy. It's about being sure you can take care of each other through good times and bad." "But Mr. Garner's rich," Jesse said with the practical logic of childhood. "He could take care of us real good." "Money isn't everything, sweetheart," Helen said, though Whit caught the brief shadow that crossed her face at the mention of his wealth. "Love isn't about what someone can buy for you. It's about what they give you from their heart." Whit studied Helen's expression, noting the way she'd stiffened slightly at Jesse's words about his wealth. For the first time since arriving in this small Colorado town, he wondered if his money might be more obstacle than asset. Helen Pike was a woman who'd fought hard for her independence, who took pride in what she'd built with her own hands. Would she ever be able to trust that his feelings for her were real, not born of pity or the desire to rescue her? "Jesse's right about one thing," Whit said carefully. "I am wealthy, more wealthy than you probably imagine. But wealth can be a burden as much as a blessing. It makes people look at you differently, question your motives, wonder what you really want from them." Helen met his eyes directly. "And what do you want from us, Whit?" The question was simple, but he knew his answer would change everything between them. He could retreat into safe generalities, maintain the careful distance that would protect them all from disappointment. Or he could tell her the truth that had been growing in his heart since that first evening at her table. "I want to belong somewhere," he said simply. "For 5 years, I've been existing but not living. You and Jesse, you've reminded me what it feels like to be truly alive." In the firelight, with Jesse watching hopefully and Helen's hand still warm on his shoulder, Whit Garner finally admitted to himself what he'd been afraid to acknowledge. He was falling in love again. And this time, he had no intention of letting business meetings or empire building steal away his chance at happiness. The next morning brought Marcus Thornfield to Helen's door like a storm cloud on an otherwise perfect day. Whit was in the kitchen helping Jesse with his arithmetic when they heard the sharp rap of knuckles against wood, followed by Helen's intake of breath that spoke of recognition and dread. Through the window, Whit caught his first glimpse of the man who held Helen's future in his hands. Thornfield was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the manner of someone who wanted to ensure others noticed his prosperity. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his handlebar moustache was waxed to sharp points that seemed to emphasize the coldness in his pale eyes. Everything about him spoke of a man who measured worth in dollars and cents, who saw sentiment as weakness to be exploited. "Mrs. Pike." Thornfield's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, formal and without warmth. "I trust you remember our conversation last week regarding your outstanding obligations." "Of course, Mr. Thornfield." Helen's voice was steady, but Whit could hear the tension beneath it. "I was hoping we might discuss possible arrangements." "The time for arrangements has passed, I'm afraid. The mortgage payment is now 4 months overdue. I've shown considerable patience, but my investors are becoming concerned about the bank's lenient policies regarding delinquent accounts." Jesse's pencil stilled in his hand, and Whit saw the boy's shoulders tense with the kind of worry no 8-year-old should carry. Automatically, Whit's hand moved to rest on Jesse's shoulder, offering what comfort he could while straining to hear the conversation at the door. "I understand your position," Helen was saying, "but surely there must be some alternative to foreclosure. I've been a reliable customer for 3 years, and this is the first time I've had difficulties." "Business is business, Mrs. Pike. Sentimentality has no place in financial matters. You have until the end of this week to produce the full amount owed $240, plus the additional late fees. I'll have no choice but to begin proceedings to reclaim the property." Whit felt Jesse flinch at the number. $240 might as well have been $2,000 to a family barely scraping by on the income from a modest boarding house. But to Whit, it was less than he spent on feed for his horses in a month. "Mr. Thornfield, please." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pike, but my decision is final. Good day." The door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. In the silence that followed, Whit heard Helen's footsteps moving slowly toward the kitchen, and when she appeared in the doorway, her face was pale, but composed with the kind of forced calm that came from years of shielding her son from adult worries. "Everything all right, Mama?" Jesse asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Just fine, sweetheart," Helen said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Mr. Thornfield just wanted to discuss some banking matters. Nothing for you to worry about." But Jesse was 8, not 3, and the look he exchanged with Whit spoke volumes about his understanding of their situation. In that moment, Whit saw Jesse's childhood eroding a little more, worn away by circumstances beyond his control. "Helen," Whit said carefully, "might I have a word with you, privately?" She hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Jesse alone with his fears, but finally nodded. "Jesse, why don't you finish your arithmetic? I'll check your work when I come back." They stepped onto the back porch, where the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. For a moment, neither spoke, both lost in their own thoughts about what they'd overheard. $240, Whit said finally. "Plus late fees," Helen added with bitter humor, "which brings the total to nearly 300. "Helen, let me help. I can write you a check right now." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and she softened her tone. "Whit, I appreciate the offer more than you know, but I can't accept charity." "It's not charity. It's—" "What is it then?" Helen's green eyes flashed with a mixture of pride and desperation. "A loan? What collateral could I possibly offer that would justify $300? The boarding house itself? And if I can't pay it back, then what? I've simply traded one creditor for another, and at least Thornfield's motives are clear." The implication hung between them that Whit's motives were not clear, that his offer of help came with unspoken expectations. The accusation stung, partly because he couldn't entirely deny it. Did he want to help Helen because it was the right thing to do, or because it would bind her to him in a way that gratitude always did? "My motives are exactly what they appear to be," he said quietly. "I care about you and Jesse. I want to help. And I'm sure you do. But Whit, you have to understand, this boarding house is all I have. It's the only thing I've built with my own hands, the only security I can provide for Jesse. If I let you pay my debts, what does that make me? Your kept woman, your charity case. It makes you someone I care about who's facing a temporary setback." Helen's laugh was hollow. "Temporary? Whit, you don't understand. This isn't a temporary setback. This is my life. I'm always one crisis away from losing everything. Jesse gets sick, the roof needs repair, the well pump breaks, and suddenly I'm behind on payments again. What happens then? Do I come to you every time I need help? Do I stop being a partner and become a dependent?" In her words, Whit heard echoes of conversations he'd had with business associates over the years, the careful balance of power that money always created, the way wealth inevitably changed relationships. He'd seen it happen dozens of times, genuine affection poisoned by the inequality of resources, love curdled by the suspicion that it was really about what one person could provide, rather than who they were. "So what do you suggest?" he asked. "I don't know," Helen admitted, her composure finally cracking. "I've been awake every night for a week trying to figure it out. I've approached every business in town looking for extra work. I've considered selling everything I own of value, but it still wouldn't be enough. I'm trapped, Whit, and I hate it. I hate feeling helpless, and I hate that Jesse has to watch me struggle." Whit reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance that had suddenly opened between them. "I need to think," she said. "I need to find a solution that doesn't involve—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "That doesn't complicate things." As she turned to go back inside, Whit felt the weight of the legal documents in his jacket pocket, the mortgage papers, the bank ownership records, all the evidence of his empire that suddenly felt more like chains than achievements. Helen Pike was slipping away from him, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much about her independence to risk losing herself in his wealth. For the first time in his adult life, Whit Garner realized that having all the money in the world might not be enough to buy him what he wanted most. The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by a nervous clerk from Thornfield's bank, who knocked on the boarding house door just as the family was finishing their evening meal. Helen answered, her face immediately tightening when she saw the official envelope in the young man's trembling hands. "Mrs. Pike?" The clerk stammered, clearly uncomfortable with his mission. "Mr. Thornfield asked me to deliver this to you personally. It's the final notice, ma'am." Helen took the envelope with steady hands, though Whit could see the slight tremor in her fingers. "Thank you, Charlie. Please tell Mr. Thornfield I received it." After the clerk left, Helen stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the envelope as if it contained a coiled snake rather than legal documents. Finally, she opened it, her eyes scanning the formal language with the resignation of someone who had expected nothing but bad news. "What is it, Mama?" Jesse asked from the kitchen table, his voice small. "It's nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart," Helen said automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. Whit rose from his chair, unable to sit still while Helen faced this crisis alone. "Helen, let me see it." She hesitated, then handed him the papers. As Whit's eyes moved over the legal language, something cold settled in his stomach. The letterhead at the top read, First National Bank of Colorado Territory, and below that, in smaller print, a subsidiary of Garner Holdings, Incorporated. The words swam before his eyes as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. Garner Holdings' empire, built over 30 years of careful acquisition and expansion. He owned banks throughout Colorado and Wyoming, properties and businesses whose names he'd forgotten in the vast web of his financial interests. And apparently, one of those banks was the very institution that now threatened to destroy Helen's life. "Whit?" Helen's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." He looked up from the papers to find both Helen and Jesse staring at him with concern. In that moment, Whit realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his relationship with these two people he'd come to love, but his understanding of himself and the empire he'd built. "Helen," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something I should have told you days ago, but I didn't realize." "Whit, you're frightening me." He set the papers down on the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly. "I own the bank." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, while Jesse's eyes widened with the kind of confusion that comes when the adult world reveals its true complexity. "What do you mean, you own the bank?" Helen asked slowly. "First National Bank of Colorado Territory is owned by Garner Holdings. That's my company, which means Marcus Thornfield works for me, though I've never met the man personally." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Helen, I swear to you, I had no idea. I own dozens of properties and businesses throughout the territory. I can't keep track of every acquisition, every subsidiary." Helen's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold fury that made Whit's heart sink. "You own the bank?" she repeated, her voice deadly quiet. "The bank that's foreclosing on my home. The bank that's been threatening my family for months, and you're telling me you didn't know?" "I didn't," Whit said desperately. "Helen, you have to believe me. If I had known—" "If you had known, what?" Helen's voice was rising now, years of frustration and fear crystallizing into anger. "You would have swooped in to save the poor widow woman? You would have played the benevolent landlord, graciously allowing me to keep my little house out of the goodness of your heart. That's not, isn't it?" Helen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "God, I'm such a fool. I actually believed that you cared about me for myself, not because I was some charity case that tugged at your heartstrings." Jesse looked between the two adults, his young face crumpling with distress. "Mama, why are you yelling at Mr. Garner? He's trying to help us." "Is he, sweetheart?" Helen's voice softened when she addressed her son, but her eyes remained fixed on Whit with laser intensity. "Or is he just playing games with people's lives because he can?" "Helen, please," Whit said, stepping toward her. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you've been sitting at my table, eating my food, sleeping under my roof, all while knowing that you could destroy my life with a word to one of your employees. How you've been watching me struggle and worry and cry myself to sleep, knowing that you control my fate." "I didn't know," Whit repeated, but even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. How could he not have known? How could a man who prided himself on his business acumen be ignorant of his own holdings? But even as he asked himself the question, he knew the answer. He'd become so wealthy, so removed from the day-to-day operations of his empire, that individual properties and businesses had become meaningless to him. He signed papers that his lawyers put in front of him, approved acquisitions that his managers recommended, all while focusing on the bigger picture, the expansion of his wealth and influence. "You want to know what I think?" Helen continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "I think you knew exactly who I was and what I was facing when you decided to stay here. I think this has all been some elaborate game to you, the wealthy cattle baron amusing himself with the struggling widow and her son." "That's not true," Whit said fiercely. "Everything I've felt, everything I've said to you, it's all been real." "Has it? Or have you just been playing a role, seeing how long you could make the poor woman dance for your entertainment before revealing that you held all the cards?" Jesse began to cry, the sound cutting through their argument like a knife. Both adults immediately turned toward him, their anger momentarily forgotten in the face of a child's distress. "Please don't fight," Jesse sobbed. "Please, I don't understand what's happening, but please don't fight." Helen immediately went to her son, pulling him into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sorry. Mama didn't mean to upset you." "Is Mr. Garner going to take our house away?" Jesse asked, his voice muffled against his mother's shoulder. The question hung in the air like a sword. Helen looked up at Whit, her eyes bright with unshed tears and a pain so deep it took his breath away. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know." Whit felt his world cracking apart around him. In the space of 10 minutes, he'd gone from a man in love planning a future to a stranger in the home that had become his sanctuary. The business contract that had seemed like mere paperwork suddenly felt like chains binding him to a system he'd helped create, but never truly examined. "Helen," he said quietly, "I know you don't believe me right now, but I need you to know something. These past few days with you and Jesse, they've been the happiest I've known since my family died. What I feel for you, what I feel for him, it has nothing to do with banks or mortgages or business contracts. It has to do with the fact that you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "And what's that?" Helen asked, though her voice remained cold. "Hope," Whit said simply. "The belief that life could be about more than just accumulating wealth. The possibility that I could be part of a family again." Helen studied his face for a long moment, and he could see her weighing his words against her anger and hurt. Finally, she shook her head. "I can't do this, Whit. I can't sit here wondering if your feelings are real or if this is all just some twisted form of charity. I can't raise my son in a house that belongs to a man who might take it away on a whim." She stood, still holding Jesse, and looked at him with eyes that had gone distant. "I think you should leave. Helen, please, just go." As Whit gathered his few belongings and prepared to walk out of the home that had briefly been his sanctuary, he realized that his wealth, the thing he'd spent 30 years building, had just cost him everything that truly mattered. The irony was bitter. He'd finally found what money couldn't buy, only to lose it because of the very money he'd accumulated. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like scattered dreams. And for the first time in 5 years, Whit Garner felt truly alone. Whit spent the next 2 days in the hotel above Henderson's General Store, staring out the window at Pike's Place and wrestling with demons he'd never acknowledged before. The comfortable room felt like a prison cell, its fine furnishings a mockery of the simple warmth he'd found in Helen's modest boarding house. Every morning, he watched Jesse leave for school, the boy's shoulders carrying a weight that seemed to have doubled since their world exploded. Every evening, he saw the lamplight in Helen's kitchen and imagined her sitting alone at the table, counting coins that would never add up to enough. On the third morning, a soft knock interrupted his brooding. He opened the door to find Jesse standing in the hallway, his school bag clutched in one hand and an envelope in the other. The boy's freckled face was serious beyond his years, and his blue eyes held a determination that reminded Whit painfully of Helen. "Jesse," Whit said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I wrote you a letter," Jesse said simply, holding out the envelope. "Mama don't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at school." Whit took the letter, noting how Jesse had carefully written Mr. Whit Garner on the front in his best penmanship. The envelope was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been carried around for some time before the boy worked up the courage to deliver it. "Would you like to come in while I read it?" Jesse shook his head. "I got to get to school before Miss Peterson marks me tardy again. But Mr. Garner Witt, I need you to know something. I don't understand all the grown-up stuff that happened, but I know you ain't a bad man. I can tell these things about people." The boy's simple faith hit Witt like a physical blow. "Jesse, just read the letter, okay? And remember what Papa used to tell me, sometimes the most important things are the hardest to say, but that don't mean we shouldn't say them." With that, Jesse turned and ran down the hallway, his school bag bouncing against his back. Witt closed the door and sat heavily on the bed, turning the envelope over in his hands. Finally, he opened it and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in Jesse's careful script. "Dear Mr. Garner, I don't know much about banks and mortgages and such, but I know about people. Mama taught me to look at what people do, not what they say, and you did good things for us. You fixed our porch and helped Mr. Porch Peterson with his wagon, and you listened to my stories and made Mama smile. Good people do good things, even when nobody's watching." Mama is scared. She don't want to say it, but I can tell. She cries at night when she thinks him sleeping, and she stares at that letter from the bank like it's gonna change if she looks at it long enough. But she's not just scared about losing the house. She's scared about you. I think she loves you. I can tell by the way she says your name and how she gets that soft look when she talks about the things you did together. But she's scared that if she lets herself love you, it will hurt worse when you leave. And she thinks you're gonna leave because rich people always leave. But you're different. I seen how you look at our little house like it's a palace. I seen how you look at me like maybe I could be important to somebody. And I seen how you look at Mama like she's the most beautiful thing in the whole world. I don't understand why grown-ups make things so complicated. If you love somebody and they love you back, shouldn't that be enough? Papa used to say love ain't about having the same amount of money or being the same kind of people. He said love is about choosing to take care of each other even when it's hard. So maybe instead of being sad about all the things that went wrong, maybe you could think about all the things that could go right. Maybe you could find a way to help us that don't make Mama feel small. Maybe you could show her that you're going to stay no matter what happens with banks and houses and all that grown-up stuff. I miss having you at our table. The house don't feel right without you there. And I think maybe you miss us too. Your friend always, Jesse Pike. P.S. I've been praying every night that God will help you and Mama figure things out because I think we could be a real good family if you just give us a chance. Witt read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of wisdom from a boy who saw the world with heartbreaking clarity. By the 3rd reading, his hands were shaking and his vision was blurred with tears he'd been holding back for days. The letter crystallized everything he'd been struggling to understand about himself and his situation. Jesse was right, had been looking at their modest home like it was a palace, because for the first time in years, he'd found wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. And Helen was right. Too, his money had made everything complicated, creating barriers where there should have been bridges. But Jesse's letter also offered something Witt hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility that love could transcend the inequalities that seemed so insurmountable. The boy's simple faith that problems could be solved if people just chose to care for each other pointed toward a solution that Witt's business-trained mind had been too tangled to see. That afternoon, Witt made his way to the town's small law office, where he spent 2 hours with attorney James Morrison, carefully explaining what he wanted to do. Morrison, a grey-haired man who'd known every family in town for 30 years, listened with growing amazement as Witt outlined his plan. "Mr. Garner," Morrison said when Witt finished, "what you're proposing is unusual, to say the least. Are you certain this is what you want?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Witt replied. The next step was more difficult. Witt rode out to Marcus Thornfield's house on the outskirts of town, a modest but pretentious dwelling that spoke of a man trying to appear more important than his circumstances warranted. Thornfield answered the door himself, his eyes widening with surprise when he recognized his unexpected visitor. "Mr. Garner, I had no idea you were in our little town. Please, come in. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Whit studied the man who had been terrorizing Helen and Jesse for months. Thornfield was exactly what he'd expected, a small-town banker who wielded his limited power with the cruelty of someone who'd never known real authority. His parlor was decorated with expensive furniture that didn't quite fit the space, and his manner carried the obsequiousness of someone suddenly faced with his true superior. "Mr. Thornfield," Whit said, declining the offered seat, "I understand you've been handling the Pike account rather aggressively." Thornfield's face went through several expressions: confusion, realization, and then a calculating look that made Whit's stomach turn. "Ah, yes, the Pike woman. I assure you, Mr. Garner, I've been handling the matter with complete professionalism. The woman is months behind on her payments, and I've been more than patient." "Patient?" Whit's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You call threatening to foreclose on a widow and her 8-year-old son patient? Well, business is business, sir. Surely you understand that sentiment has no place in financial matters. The bank's reputation depends on—" "The bank's reputation," Whit interrupted, "depends on serving the community, not destroying it. Mrs. Pike has been a customer for 3 years without incident. Her current difficulties are temporary, caused by circumstances beyond her control." Thornfield's manner shifted, becoming more defensive. "Mr. Garner, with all due respect, I've been running this bank for 5 years without complaint from your management company. My methods may seem harsh, but they're effective. We have the lowest default rate in the territory because I don't allow delinquent accounts to drag on indefinitely." "Your methods," Whit said coldly, "are about to change. Effective immediately, you will extend Mrs. Pike's mortgage terms and reduce her interest rate to 2%. You will also forgive all late fees that have accrued." Thornfield's face flushed red. "Sir, I must protest. Such lenient terms will set a dangerous precedent. Other customers will expect similar treatment, and other customers who face genuine hardship will receive similar consideration," Whit said firmly. "Banking is a service industry, Mr. Thornfield, not a collection agency. But the profit margins will survive a reduction in interest income. What they won't survive is a reputation for heartlessness." Whit moved toward the door, then turned back. "One more thing, Mr. Thornfield. You will personally apologize to Mrs. Pike for the distress your aggressive tactics have caused her family. And you will do it with genuine humility, not professional courtesy." As Whit left Thornfield's house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of using his power for something beyond personal gain. But even as he savored the moment, he knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Changing the bank's policy would solve Helen's immediate financial crisis, but it wouldn't address the deeper issue between them. The trust that had been broken wouldn't be repaired by mortgage modifications and reduced interest rates. That evening, as he sat in his hotel room watching the sun set over the mountains, Whit realized that Jesse's letter had given him more than hope it had given him direction. The boy was right. Love shouldn't be about having the same amount of money or being the same kind of people. It should be about choosing to care for each other despite the complications. But first, Whit needed to show Helen that his feelings were real, that his wealth didn't define his worth any more than her lack of it defined hers, and he thought he knew exactly how to do it. The next morning, he would put the final part of his plan into motion. It was a gamble that would either restore what they'd lost or destroy any remaining chance they had at happiness. But as Jesse had written, sometimes the most important things were the hardest to say, in this case, the hardest to do. Looking out at Pike's Place one more time, Whit whispered a prayer to whatever gods protected foolish men in love, and prepared to risk everything on the chance that Jesse Pike was right about the power of choosing to care for each other, no matter how complicated things became. The piano arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by 4 men who struggled to maneuver it through Pike's Place front door while half the town gathered to watch. It was the same instrument Jesse had admired in Henderson's store window, the one that had belonged to Mrs. Henderson's aunt, with its worn mahogany finish and ivory keys that had yellowed with age. But to Whit, who stood across the street watching from the shadows, it represented something far more precious than mere music. Helen emerged from her kitchen at the sound of the commotion, flour dusting her apron and confusion written across her face. "Excuse me," she said to the lead mover, "but there's been some mistake. I didn't order a piano." "No mistake, ma'am," the man replied, consulting the paper in his hands. "Delivery for Mrs. Helen Pike, paid in full. Where would you like us to put it?" "But I don't understand. Who?" Helen's voice trailed off as she spotted Whit across the street. Even from that distance, he could see the complex emotions that crossed her face: surprise, recognition, and something that might have been either anger or hope. Jesse appeared beside his mother, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the piano being maneuvered into their parlor. "Mama, it's the piano, the one from Henderson's store." His voice carried pure joy, untainted by the complicated adult emotions surrounding the gift. "Jesse, sweetheart, go inside," Helen said quietly, her eyes still fixed on Whit. "But Mama, inside, now." As the movers finished their work and departed, a crowd of neighbors lingered on the street, drawn by curiosity and the rare excitement of seeing such an expensive instrument delivered to the modest boarding house. Whit could hear their whispered conversations, see their speculative glances as they tried to piece together the story behind the gift. Finally, Helen crossed the street toward him, her steps measured and her expression unreadable. When she reached him, they stood facing each other in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. "A piano," she said finally. "Jesse mentioned how much you missed playing," Whit replied. "How much it meant to your family before you had to sell yours." "It's beautiful," Helen admitted, glancing back at her house, where the instrument now graced her parlor window. "And expensive, too expensive. Not too expensive for what it represents." Helen's jaw tightened. "And what does it represent, Whit? Your guilt? Your attempt to buy forgiveness?" The accusation stung, partly because Whit couldn't entirely deny the grain of truth in it. "It represents my understanding of what matters to you, what brings you joy. You think you understand what matters to me." Helen's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You think a piano, however beautiful, can make up for the fact that you've been lying to me since the day we met. I never lied to you. Lying by omission is still lying, Whit. You let me pour out my heart about our financial troubles, let me worry myself sick about losing my home, all while knowing you had the power to fix everything with a word." Whit felt the familiar frustration rise in his chest. "I told you I didn't know about the bank connection until I saw that final notice. My business holdings are vast, Helen. I can't keep track of every subsidiary, every property." "That's exactly the problem." Helen's voice rose, drawing glances from the lingering neighbors. "You're so wealthy, so removed from the consequences of your empire, that you don't even know when you're destroying people's lives. Do you have any idea what it feels like to be just another entry in a ledger book you don't even bother to read?" The words hit Whit like physical blows, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding for years. She was right, had become so insulated by his wealth that the human cost of his business decisions had become invisible to him. People like Helen and Jesse were reduced to numbers on reports filed by managers he rarely met. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've spent so many years building an empire that I lost sight of the fact that it's made up of real people with real lives. People like you and Jesse, who deserved better than to be threatened by a banker acting in my name." Helen's expression softened slightly at his admission, but her guard remained up. "The piano is lovely, Whit, truly, but it doesn't change anything between us. It doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is that I can never be sure whether you care about me for who I am or because I represent some sort of redemption for you. The poor widow you can rescue to make yourself feel better about all the other poor widows your empire has crushed." Before Whit could respond, Jesse burst through the front door of the boarding house, his excitement too great to be contained any longer. "Mr. Garner," he called, running across the street toward them. "Did you really buy us that piano? Did you really?" Helen caught her son as he reached them, her hands automatically smoothing his hair. "Jesse, we talked about this." "But Mama, it's the most beautiful thing I ever saw." And it sounds perfect, I tried. One of the keys real gentle-like, and it's tuned and everything. Jesse's face glowed with happiness as he looked between the two adults. Now you can play again, just like before Papa died. You can play those songs you used to hum while you cooked, and maybe you can teach me to play them too. The pure joy in Jesse's voice seemed to crack something in Helen's composure. Whit saw tears gather in her eyes as she looked at her son, then at the piano visible through their parlor window, then back at him. "Jesse," she said carefully, "accepting such an expensive gift creates obligations, complications." "What kind of complications?" Jesse asked, with the direct honesty that had become familiar to both adults. Helen struggled for words that could explain adult complexities to a child's heart. When someone gives you something so valuable, it changes the relationship between you. It creates debts that can't be easily repaid. Jesse considered this with the seriousness he brought to all adult problems. Then he looked up at Whit with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "Mr. Garner," he said, "do you expect anything from us because you bought the piano?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct in the way only children could manage. Whit felt the weight of it, understanding that his answer would determine not just Jesse's opinion of him, but possibly Helen's as well. "No, Jesse," he said finally, "I expect nothing except the chance to hear your mother play again, if she chooses to. The piano is a gift, not a loan or a bargain or an obligation. It's simply something I wanted to give to people who have given me far more than I could ever repay." Jesse beamed at this answer, but Helen's expression remained guarded, as if she were weighing his words against her experience of how the world actually worked. "And what have we given you that's so valuable?" she asked quietly. Whit met her eyes directly, putting everything he felt into his voice. "You've given me back my capacity to hope, Helen. You've shown me what it means to be part of a family again. You've reminded me that there are things in this world worth more than all the cattle and land I've spent my life accumulating." The truth of his words seemed to resonate in the space between them, and for just a moment, Whit thought he saw her walls begin to lower. But then she stepped back, gathering Jesse closer to her side. "The piano is beautiful, Whit, and I'm grateful for the thought behind it, but gestures, however grand, don't solve the real problem between us." As she turned to go back into the house, Whit realized that his first gesture, however well-intended, had not been enough. The piano might represent his understanding of what brought Helen joy, but it didn't address her deeper need, the need to know that their relationship was built on something more solid than his wealth and her need. That evening, as twilight painted the Colorado sky in shades of purple and gold, Whit stood once again at Helen's front door. But this time, he carried something different, not another expensive gift, but a simple envelope containing a train ticket. The same northbound ticket he'd carried, that first day at the station, now worn from being handled, but never used. Jesse answered his knock, his face lighting up with hope. "Mr. Garner, did you come to hear Mama play the piano? She's been sitting at it for an hour, just touching the keys real soft-like, but she ain't played nothing yet." "Actually, Jesse, I came to talk to your mother about something important, something that might change everything." Helen appeared in the doorway behind her son, her expression wary but curious. "Jesse, go practice your letters for tomorrow's spelling test." "But Mama..." "Now, sweetheart." After Jesse reluctantly disappeared into the kitchen, Helen stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. The space between them felt charged with possibility and fear, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. "Helen," Whit began, pulling the envelope from his jacket pocket, "I want to show you something." She looked at the envelope suspiciously. "If this is another grand gesture..." "It's not. It's something I should have done days ago." He held out the train ticket, watching her face carefully. "This is my ticket north, back to my ranch. Back to my old life." Helen took the ticket, examining it with confusion. "I don't understand. Are you leaving?" "That depends on you." "Whit, what are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would either restore what they'd lost or end it forever. This morning, I signed papers transferring ownership of First National Bank to the town. A community trust, managed by a board of local residents including Doc Morrison, Pastor Williams, and Mrs. Henderson. No more outside ownership, no more distant corporate decisions affecting people's lives. Helen stared at him, the ticket trembling slightly in her hands. You did what? I gave away the bank, completely, along with enough capital to ensure it operates in the community's best interest for generations. Witt's voice grew stronger as he continued. But that's not all. I've also signed papers transferring all my properties in Colorado Territory to similar community trusts. The businesses, the land holdings, everything. Witt, that's impossible. That's your entire empire. My empire in Colorado Territory, he corrected. I still have holdings in Wyoming, Montana, other territories. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But not enough to be the kind of wealthy man whose money makes normal relationships impossible. Helen sank down onto one of the porch chairs, the weight of his words clearly overwhelming her. Why would you do such a thing? Because I realized something, Helen. That train ticket, I've been carrying it for a week, telling myself I was staying for you and Jesse. But the truth is, I was staying for me. I was trying to have it both ways, Keep. My wealth and my power, while also having the simple life you represent. He sat down in the chair beside her, close enough to see the confusion and wonder in her green eyes. But I can't have both. My wealth will always be a barrier between us, always make you question whether I'm with you because I love you or because I'm trying to play the benevolent benefactor. So you're giving it all away. I'm giving away the part that stands between us and any chance at a real future together. Witt reached over and gently took her hands in his. Helen, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that your answer, whatever it is, won't change what I've done. I'm not trying to buy your love or manipulate you into a decision. Helen's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hands away. What do you want to ask me? Marry me. Not because I can solve your financial problems or give you security. You're strong enough to create your own security. Marry me because we love each other. Because Jesse deserves a father who will put family before business. Because I want to spend whatever years I have left making music with you and building something that matters more than any empire. The silence that followed was profound. Through the window, they could hear Jesse practicing his spelling words, his young voice carefully pronouncing each letter. The ordinary sound of a child's homework seemed to emphasize the momentous nature of what was happening on the porch. The new train ticket, Helen said finally, holding up the envelope. Where does it go? Wherever we decide to go. Together, if you'll have me. Or alone, if that's what you choose. Witt's voice was steady, but Helen could see the hope and fear warring in his eyes. I bought it this afternoon, after I finished with the lawyers. It's open-ended, we can use it any time, go anywhere. Helen stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the town that had been her whole world for 3 years. When she turned back to face him, her expression had transformed. The wariness was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like wonder. You gave up your empire for me? I gave up my empire for us, for the chance to be part of a family again, to be a man worthy of your love and Jesse's trust. Helen moved toward him, her steps slow but deliberate. When she reached his chair, she took his face in her hands, studying it as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Witt Garner, she said softly, you are either the most foolish man I've ever met, or the wisest. Which do you think it is? Her answer came not in words, but in the kiss she pressed to his lips, gentle at first, then deeper, filled with all the love and hope and possibility that had been building between them since that first evening at her dinner table. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Witt could see his own amazement reflected in Helen's eyes. Does this mean yes? He asked. This means yes to all of it, Helen whispered. To marriage, to family, to whatever adventure that train ticket might take us on. But first, Helen smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. First, you're going to come inside and listen to me play that beautiful piano you bought. And then we're going to tell Jesse that he's about to get the father he's been praying for. As they walked hand in hand toward the door, the new train ticket still clutched in Helen's free hand, Whit realized that he'd finally found something worth more than all the wealth he'd spent his life accumulating, a future built on love rather than money, and the promise of a family that chose each other not out of need but out of joy. 6 months later, the small church where Thomas and Helen Pike had once exchanged vows hosted another wedding, simpler but no less meaningful. Helen stood at the altar in a dress of cream-colored silk that she'd sewn herself, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers Jesse had picked that morning from the meadow behind their house. Beside her, Whit wore his best suit, but more importantly, he wore the expression of a man who had finally found his way home. Jesse stood between them as ring-bearer, his freckled face glowing with happiness as he watched his mother and the man who had chosen to become his father exchange vows. In his small hand, he held the rings, not expensive bands bought from some distant jeweler, but simple gold circles that Whit had commissioned from the local blacksmith, each one engraved with words that mattered more than any precious stone. Choose love always. Pastor Williams, who had known Helen since she was Jesse's age, spoke of second chances and the courage it took to trust in love again after loss. His words carried extra weight for the small congregation gathered in the pews, neighbors and friends who had watched this unlikely romance unfold, who had seen wealth humbled by wisdom and pride transformed into partnership. Marriage, the pastor said, his kind eyes moving between the bride and groom, is not about finding someone to complete you, but about choosing someone to share your completeness with. Helen and Whit, you come to this union not as broken pieces seeking wholeness, but as whole people choosing to build something greater together. When it came time for the rings, Jesse stepped forward with the solemnity of someone entrusted with a sacred duty. As Whit slipped the simple band onto Helen's finger, his voice was steady and clear. With this ring, I promise to choose you every day, in sunshine and storm, in wealth and want, in all the adventures yet to come. Helen's voice trembled only slightly as she made her own pledge. With this ring, I promise to trust in the love we've built, to believe in the future we're creating, and to never forget that the greatest riches are the ones we share. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and profound, witnessed by a community that had learned to believe in happy endings. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, the church filled with applause and the kind of joy that comes from seeing good people find their way to each other, despite all obstacles. The reception that followed was held in the garden behind Pike's Plusno, officially the Garner home, with tables laden with dishes contributed by every family in town. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with a 3-layer cake, while Doc Morrison provided music on his fiddle for dancing under the stars. It was exactly the kind of celebration Helen had dreamed of, intimate, joyful, and filled with the people who mattered most. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away with promises to visit soon, Whit found himself sitting on the front porch with Jesse, watching Helen move through their home, now saying goodbye to the last of their friends. The simple wedding ring caught the lamplight as she gestured, and Whit marveled again at how something so modest could represent such profound change. "Papa Whit," Jesse said, testing out the name they'd agreed upon, "can I ask you something?" The title still made Whit's chest tighten with emotion. "Of course, son. Are you happy? I mean really happy, even though you gave away all that money and land and stuff?" Whit considered the question seriously, as Jesse's thoughtful nature deserved. 6 months ago, he had been one of the wealthiest men in the Colorado Territory, owner of an empire that stretched across thousands of acres. Tonight, he was the husband of a woman who ran a modest boarding house and the father of an 8-year-old boy who collected marbles and dreamed of fixing broken harmonicas. "Jesse," he said finally, "I spent 30 years accumulating wealth, thinking that was what would make me happy. But you know what I learned?" "What?" "I learned that happiness isn't something you can buy or build or own. It's something you choose every single day by deciding what matters most to you." Whit put his arm around Jesse's shoulders, pulling him close. And what matters most to me is sitting right here on this porch with you, married to your mama, getting ready to start each new day as a family." Jessie nodded solemnly, then brightened. "And now Mama plays the piano every evening after supper, just like she used to do with Papa. Except now you're here to listen too." "That's right. And do you know what my favorite song is?" "Which one?" "The one she was humming this morning while she made breakfast. I don't know the name of it, but it sounded like contentment." Helen appeared in the doorway, her wedding dress exchanged for a simple blue dress that Whit had come to love because it was so essentially her practical, beautiful, and chosen with care rather than expense. "What are my two favorite men discussing so seriously?" she asked, settling into the chair beside them. "Papa Whit was telling me about contentment," Jessie said, "and how happiness is something you choose." "Is that so?" Helen's eyes met Whit's over Jessie's head, and in them he saw his own wonder, reflected the amazement of two people who had found each other, despite all the reasons it shouldn't have worked. "Speaking of choosing," Whit said, reaching into his vest pocket, "I have something for both of you." He pulled out Jessie's harmonica, its silver surface now gleaming, and its broken reed replaced. "I thought it was time this made music again." Jessie's gasp of delight could probably be heard 3 counties over. He took the instrument with reverent hands, bringing it to his lips and producing a clear, sweet note that seemed to harmonize with the evening breeze. "It's perfect," Jessie breathed. "It sounds just like it did when Papa gave it to me." "Not just like it did," Helen corrected gently, reaching over to smooth her son's hair. "Better, because now it's been broken and made whole again, and that gives it a different kind of beauty." As Jessie began to play a simple melody his father had taught him years ago, Helen reached for Whit's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the simple gold bands on their ring fingers catching the last light of day. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For staying that first night, for choosing to see past the complications to what really mattered, for teaching Jessie that men keep their promises, for showing me that love doesn't always come when you expect it, but it comes when you need it most." Whit brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Thank you for inviting a lonely stranger to dinner and changing his entire life." As the Colorado stars began to appear overhead and Jessie's harmonica filled the evening air with music, Whit Garner realized he had finally found the answer to a question he'd been asking himself for 5 years. What made life worth living? It wasn't the empire he'd built or the wealth he'd accumulated. It was this, the sound of his stepson's laughter, the warmth of his wife's hand in his, the promise of tomorrow mornings that would begin with the people he loved most. In choosing love over empire, partnership over power, he had discovered that the richest man wasn't the one who owned the most, but the one who was loved the best. And by that measure, sitting on the porch of a modest boarding house in a small Colorado town, Whit Garner was the wealthiest man alive.